item number 9. We have a presentation by Dr. Anastasiou. Thank you very much for coming in present. And we're going to be.
I should stand.
Wherever you
I should
want.
stand.
Yeah, why not?
I don't have to sit. Is this the camera? So
Yeah.
I'm
Yeah.
here. I'm here. Who has the? Can I? You got it? Okay, cool.
Tell me.
Yeah, so thank you all for inviting me to come and talk. A lot of you probably have seen these will have seen many of these slides more than once. So hopefully it's not a broken record to some of you, but I did want to come and share some of our results for those of you who may not have had a chance to come to one of the presentations, either at the Seagrass Working Group or some of the other meetings that I've been to present the mapping results that we have for 2022. So today I'm going to talk specifically about Lemon Bay and Charlotte Harbor, but sort of in the context of the larger mapping effort that we do every 2 years. Next slide, please. So just kind of orient everybody as to what we at the Southwest Florida Water Management District do in terms of mapping seagrass. We've been mapping seagrass on the West Coast since 1988, specifically from Tampa Bay South. Starting around 2006, we started mapping what we call the Springs Coast, which is from about Anclote Key north to just on the east side of Cedar Key. And we do that every 4 years. So 2022, we did not map the Springs Coast. We will be doing that in 24. But the Sun Coast, we map every 2 years. And this is really a continuous process. And what I mean by that is that we wrapped up the 22 results a few months ago. We're now gearing up for 24, which is getting ready to kick off. Next slide. I'm just going to go through these really fast because I want to get to the results and keep it within like 20 minutes. So when we talk about the Sun Coast, the region that we're talking about, the estuaries are the Clearwater Harbor, St. Joseph Sound, Tampa Bay, Sarasota Bay, Lemon Bay, and Charlotte Harbor. So we're going to focus on Lemon Bay and Charlotte Harbor today, since that's where we are. Next. Real quick on the mapping process. So this is not a quick and easy process. This takes quite a while, which is why it takes upwards of about eight months before we can actually release some of the preliminary numbers. There's 3 kind of phases or segments in terms of mapping. There's the acquisition, field verification, and photo interpretation. Of course, we start with acquisition. Field verification sort of happens throughout the cycle, and then photo interpretation is the generation of the maps. Next. Our flight window is December 1st to the end of February. So that normally the 28th, next year it will be the 29th because it's leap year. It used to be November 1st. So our flight window was November 1st to the end of February. We changed that during this cycle, and it's a permanent change. And the reason why we switched from November to December is because November looks a lot like September, more so than it does December anymore, because the climate's changed, temperatures have changed, the atmospheric conditions have changed. You still get cumulus cloud buildup like you do in September, in November now. We've seen consecutive almost weeks of temperatures at or above 80 degrees. So we decided we're just going to go ahead and push it to December 1st. So that's our flight window now. Starts. So for the 24 maps coming up, our flight window actually opens this year. So we're getting ready to fly for 24 in December. That's just an important thing to keep in the back of your mind when we talk about the results. When we say 2022 Seagrass results, what we're really talking about is December 21 to February 22. So it's the winter of 21-22. And that's important, especially here, because the results you're going to see are pre-Hurricane Ian. Okay, next slide. Field verification, we do an independent accuracy assessment. I don't have time to go into the details on how we do that. The bottom line is that if we can achieve a 90% or better result in our independent, and when I say independent, I mean that we have a third-party contractor come in and do the analysis, and in most cases collect the data as well. So it's an independent assessment outside of what the photo interpreters are doing and outside of what we're doing. And if we can achieve a 90% or greater accuracy, then we accept the map product. That's sort of our baseline for acceptance of the map. The photo interpreters or the PIs do their own field verification, and then we do these post-map spot checks. One thing I want to stress too here is a couple of things. One, partnerships. Jennifer had on her slide earlier about partnerships being really important. A lot of the data that we collect comes from other places. Dave Blewett, Mindy, your group, a bunch of folks, Sarasota County, the Estuary programs. We collect a lot of data. But we also have specific field points that we visit, and we have gone, we've hit new records every time we do this. Now we've gone over 2,000 field verification points across the Suncoast region to help produce this map. And a lot of that is possible because of the advancement in technology. We use GoPros in almost every one of these sites. So we have video, underwater video at almost every one of these locations, which we then catalog. We do our point attribution back in the office now. We don't do it in the field anymore. So the days of scrambling with a pencil and clipboard to try to write down everything you see, those are rapidly coming to an end. And we collect video, we take it back, and then we take our time. And we usually have multiple people that take a look at those videos. Plus those videos then become a catalog for future generations to look back on and say, this is what we meant when we said that was a continuous seagrass bed. Okay, next. And then of course the PI, the photo interpretation, is that's sort of where, you know, the rubber meets the road. We're making maps, and that's what photo interpretation is. It's based on a modified land use land cover code. I'm going to go through these really fast, but I think it's important that everybody understand what we mean when we look at different flux codes. And I'm only going to focus on the three major ones. Okay, next slide. And that's continuous, which is the code 9116, patchy, which is 9113, and attached algae, which is 9121. There's many more codes that we map, but these are the big ones. Obviously, continuous and patchy refer to seagrass. That's what we map to get our total acreages. Attached algae is not part of seagrass, but it's really important. Okay, next slide. So what do we mean by continuous? When you see a map and you see a nice dark green polygon and it says continuous seagrass, what do we mean by that? Well, this is what we mean. It has to have a uniform signature that's between 25 and 100% cover. And there's a couple of other elements to this definition. I'm not going to read it, but there are certain signatures in the imagery that will cause an area to be mapped as a continuous seagrass bed. The picture on the left kind of gives you an idea of what it looks like in reality, and then on the right is kind of an example of a map where you see a 9116 signature. All right, next slide. 9113 is patchy. I don't like this term. Actually, I can't stand this term. It's really sparse. It should be sparse / patchy. We use patchy by convention because everybody is used to seeing it. We've been using it since 1988, so we still use it. But really, when you hear the term patchy, don't just think of this as like this top right is an idealized image of a patchy seagrass bed where you got these nice little distinct patches. It could also be sparse. So really the bottom line is if you have less than 25%, but greater than 10% signature of grass, that's going to fall into this 9113 category. So call it patchy, call it sparse, whatever you want to call it. That's what really is the operational or functional definition. It's 25% to 10%. Why 10%? Because if you're less than 10% cover, we can't see it. The plane that collects the imagery flies around 9,000 feet. And 9,000 feet above sea level, you can't see grass less than 10%. That's kind of the cutoff. And that's important. And it's important because some areas we are seeing signs of some potential recovery. There's grass out there, and we know that because we collect field verification points, and we work with partners who tell us, yeah, there's grass over there. But if it's less than 10%, if it's 3 or 4 blades of haliduli, we're not going to see it. So it's not going to get mapped. Next. And then the last one is attached algae. So this one's weird here because when we think of attached algae elsewhere, we almost always think of Caulerpa prolifera, or I always mess up the name, Sarah, the one with the serrated edges. Thank you. God, I don't know why I can't. I'm not block on that one. But of course, for those of us who work in Charlotte Harbor, we know our friend Caulerpa fastigiata has been very high on our list. Fastigiata is very weird because it can be filamentous, but it can also be attached, as can some of these other macroalgae as well. So This term, attached algae, in most places, you think of Caulerpa prolifera, the other one that I can't name. But in Charlotte Harbor, most of that attached algae seems to be in the form of fastigiata, and that's kind of an interesting thing. Same as far as the operational definition, it's the same as that for continuous seagrass, except instead of seagrass, we're talking about attached algae. Okay, next slide. And so just to kind of recap before we get into the results, when we talk about the total seagrass, so you're going to see numbers and acreage totals. Total seagrass is continuous plus patchy. And I'm going to spend a little bit of time kind of talking about that because I think that's often overlooked. Those two categories are really important to know which one is and what is the status and trends of one versus the other. But just remember, patchy plus continuous equals total. Attached algae is not mapped as part of the seagrass total, but it is an important element. The other thing that you have to really remember when you're looking at these numbers is by convention, we do not map drift algae. There's several reasons for that. Drift algae has become and continues to be a very important part of these ecosystems. And so it's a really important thing to track, monitor, and potentially map. But we don't map it because it's drifting. It's potentially misleading if we map drift algae. So we don't at this point. And then the other thing just to remember is that we're mapping distribution. We're not mapping quality. So a seagrass signature that is a continuous bed really doesn't say anything about the health of that seagrass bed. Could be really healthy, could be just hanging on, but it happens to be still pretty dense patch. So just things to consider. All right, next. So that's it. That was like, I don't know how long that took, but that was a really fast overview of how we map seagrass. So next slide I'm going to show you is the table of the 2022 results for all the Suncoast estuaries. And so those of you who have already seen this, you can probably think about what you're going to do later today. But for those of you who haven't seen this table, there's a couple of things that are important that should stand out. Number one is that St. Joseph Sound, Clearwater Harbor, we actually saw a gain in grass, about 1,300 acres more seagrass in that estuary than we had in 2020, about an 8% change. The rest of the estuaries, similar to 2020, when you compare 2018 to 2020, we saw declines. The one thing that's really interesting about 22 results is that it's flipped. So if I was standing here 2 years ago, which I wouldn't because we would have been in COVID, but the 2020 presentation would have shown the opposite, where the greatest loss was in Charlotte Harbor. And then you had less loss as you went north. This time around, it's switched. Tampa Bay saw the greatest loss, followed by Sarasota Bay, Clement Bay, and then Charlotte Harbor really didn't see much change. -2% is kind of within what we would consider the noise level of the map. Anything really less than 4, for those of you who are water quality minded or water chemistry minded, you know what a practical quantitative limit is. It's kind of like anything below that, somewhere in the ballpark. That's about 4%, plus or minus. And then there's the detection limit. Anything less than 2%, that's really within the noise of the map. So plus or minus 2%, in my mind, is really no change. So Charlotte Harbor, not much, but that's not the end of the story. That's a top line number. There's a lot going on in Charlotte Harbor, and that's what I'm going to kind of focus on from here on. I'm going to touch on London Bay first, and then we're going to kind of spend a little bit of time on Charlotte Harbor. But this is what the numbers look like. The reason why we think there's an increase in Clearwater Sound, St. Joseph Sound is probably a function of geography and hydrodynamics. That estuary really behaves more like the Springs Coast than it does the Sun Coast. And if I was presenting the 2020 numbers for Sun Coast, you would have seen we saw some pretty big gains in Enclave in the area just north of that.
Hey, Chris,
Yeah,
before you get into Sarasota, Lemon, et cetera, could you talk a little bit about Tampa Bay? It was on the news the other day, the
Yes.
loss of 4,000 acres.
Yes.
Is this associated with the phosphate spill?
Yes and no. So, there's a lot of speculation as to what impact Piney Point had on Tampa Bay. Certainly it did have an impact. I mean, that's been documented. Where if I had to speculate, I would say the area that we saw the most likely impact of Piney Point was Hillsborough Bay. And Hillsborough Bay lost a lot. I mean, Hillsborough Bay is small, so there's not a lot of grass there overall. But we lost since 2016 over 80% of the grass in Hillsborough Bay. And just between 2020 and 22, we lost, I can't remember the number, but it's over 30%. We were seeing a bit of a recovery in 2020 in Hillsborough Bay, and then Piney Point happened and we saw it drop again. So I think there's definitely some, there's something there. You look at some of the hydrodynamic modeling, you see some of that water likely did move up the shipping channel in Hillsborough Bay. So that would be the area where I'd say is most likely was impacted by Piney Point. The other areas like Old Tampa Bay was the big loser in Tampa Bay. And that's really what drives most of this loss. More than half of that came from Old Tampa Bay. And a lot of that has to do with the pyridinium blooms that have been persistent in that system. Yeah. All right, so let's go to Lemon Bay. And one thing really quick for those of you who are familiar with these maps, we used to report Lemon Bay as one segment. This year, what we did is we split Donna and Roberts Bay and Lemon Bay. Partly because even though Donna Roberts Bay is really, really small, it's just kind of isolated out there by itself. And so it was getting lost in the Lemon Bay. So we split it up and I'll show you what that looks like. I think I have both in there. So yeah, this is combined. So this is what you would have seen. And we went back and split this up all the way back from the 1988 data. So now we have a time series for Donna and Roberts Bay and one for Lemons Bay. This is just a combination of the two. This is what it looked like in 2020. And you can see the loss here on the graph in the bottom left from 2018 to 2020. We saw that loss. We actually saw it starting in 2016 and we saw back-to-back losses. Now, if we fast forward to 22, you'll see that we did see a continued loss, but much less. Not nearly the loss that we saw between 2018 and 2020. So a bit of a kind of leveling out. But the thing, and this table right here shows you kind of how it splits out. So Donna and Roberts Bay, 33% loss. That's a pretty big loss for that little system. And it's only 16 acres, but that's a lot for Donna and Roberts Bay. So that gets lost if you don't split these up. So now that we have Donna and Roberts Bay as its own segment, we're able to really track that and see that over time. Let's go to the next slide. I don't remember if I have. Yeah. Okay. Cool. So again, this is combined, but this kind of speaks to, and I'm gonna show this in subsequent slides as well, where it's going to be a little bit more important. But something to look at when you look at this graph on the bottom left, we always talk about the top line number, the total acreage. But as we had said earlier, it's really important that we also look at the different flux codes, the different categories of grass, the continuous versus the patchy. And if you look at, and again, this is going to be driven almost exclusively by Lemon Bay. Donna and Roberts Bay, they're so small, it's lost in this graph. So this is essentially, I'm showing you Lemon Bay. But what you see is that most of the grass in Lemon Bay is mapped as continuous. And what does continuous mean? It means it's more dense, which tends to suggest that the grasses are more stable, perhaps even healthier than a patchy or a sparse seagrass area, which are more indicative of marginal areas where they kind of, and a lot of times it's haladuli, which will just come and go. So you want more continuous grass because that tells us or suggests that your system is more stable, perhaps even more resilient to some of these events like storms and red tides. So interesting trend, when you go back to 1988, most of the grass in Lemon Bay was patchy. And we had a flip in the 90s, and we continue to see most of the grass being continuous, and that's good news. So yeah, we saw a pretty sharp decline. That's bad news. We're actually down below where we have been even in 1988. So yeah, the top line story is really bad, which is that you're at record lows, seagrass in Lemon Bay. But the kind of underlying story is that, yes, that stinks, but most of that loss is driven by the patchy seagrass, which means it's more likely that that grass will come back because it's usually that sort of more ephemeral haladuli type grasses. As long as your continuous is holding on, we have reason to be at least cautiously optimistic that the system can get back to where it was. All right, next slide. All right, so we just kind of talked about that. Next slide. Okay, so now we're going to talk about Charlotte Harbor. So -2%, not much loss. the harbor's doing fine, right? We can just walk away and not worry about it. It's end of story. No. Look at all these segments that we have, and there's a story within each of these. I don't have time to go through every one of them, but let's go to the next slide and we'll show you kind of where this all breaks out by harbor segment. This is what it looked like in 2020. Not a good year, right? That was real loss. A lot of that loss came in the east wall. We think there's a lot of linkages between that prolonged red tide event following Hurricane Irma and what we saw in Charlotte Harbor in terms of seagrass loss. Next slide. Now let's fast forward to 2022. And again, overall -2%, not much change, but look at the percent change differences within each of these segments. There's a lot going on here. And probably the ones that are going to catch your eye most are going to be the Peace River with -30%. Of course, again, that's 100 acres relative to, almost 15,000 acres total. It's a small number harbor wide, but it's meaningful for that segment. But the other one that really catches my eye and was actually surprising was the west wall. 27% gain in grass along this west wall of Charlotte Harbor. That's what 386 acres more seagrass in 22 than we had in 2020. Good news, right? That's awesome. Things are doing great. Well, maybe. Let's go to the next slide. All right, so again, it's important to look at not only the total, but also the continuous versus the patchy. And again, bad top line story, bad news. We're still at record lows, lower seagrass than we've had since we started mapping in 1988. The good news, not much change between 20 and 22. That's good. The other good news here is as well, if you look back from about 2002, prior to that, most of your grass in the harbor was patchy. So it wasn't very dense. It was more sparse, more patchy. That flipped in the mid 2000s. And even today, even though we have less grass total, most of it is still continuous grass beds, which again is reason to be at least cautiously optimistic that those areas where we have good, healthy, stable beds continue to be good, healthy, and stable. It's those marginal areas that are getting hit. For the most part, there are some exceptions, and we're going to talk about that. But the map on the right is the change analysis. So green is gain, red is loss. You can see, again, a lot of the loss along the east wall, Turtle Bull Bay, saw some loss. Most of the gain, you can see that green line along the west wall is along that deep edge. So what we lost in 2020 along the deep edge of the west wall came back in 22. Okay, next slide. So what I'm going to do is kind of zoom in on some of these locations, just to kind of give you a something to think about. And we're not going to cover all the segments, but I'm going to hit some of the highlights. This one's an important one because that 27% gain was like, that's awesome. We're going to do a happy dance. West Wall, everything is great. Maybe, maybe not. Let's take another look at this. So this is what it looked like in 2020. And again, remember 2020, big drops harbor wide. Between 2018, 2020, we lost a lot of grass, mainly along that deep edge. Now let's go to the next slide. And the 22 map shows that return of a lot of that deep edge. So that light green, it's all, in fact, if you look at the graph of the table on the top left, you can see the vast majority of the gain, all of the gain actually, is in the patchy coverage. 114% gain, 626 acres of new grass that we saw come back that was lost in 2020 has come back along the deep edge. It's 114% gain, but it's all patchy. In fact, we saw 28% loss in continuous. Where did that loss happen? Let's look at go to the next slide. I think I have this. Yeah, so where did the loss happen? Happened right here in these back areas, and so a little bit up here in the mouth of the Maca River. That I'm not as concerned about because it's driven a lot by that freshwater inflow. This is something to watch though, because this was mapped previously as continuous grass and we lost it. So that means those continuous beds down here are destabilizing a little bit. We're starting to see some open areas. And as anybody who's been in the harbor knows, those open areas are not always sand. They're a lot of times filled with drift algae. Here, actually, because I went out with Dave and Mindy, some of your folks, what was it, last month? And I was actually quite pleased to see there wasn't a lot of algae out there along the west wall. It actually looked pretty decent. And this was after Hurricane Ian. So I don't know, it kind of made me feel a little bit happy. But this area here is something to keep an eye on. So while the news is overall good for West Wall, 27% gain, just remember that gain happened in the patching, and we actually lost some of the continuous. If you go back one slide, oh, you can't really see it. It's really hard to see on this. Maybe the guys online can see it better, but that 9121 code, that kind of purplish color, remember, that's attached algae. And in this part of the world, what we mean when we say attached algae is mostly Chloropa fastigiata. And if you were able to see on the screen here, for those of you live, that area where we saw the loss corresponds to a change from 9116 continuous seagrass to 9121, which is attached algae. So we're seeing a little bit of a shift from continuous seagrass to attached algae. So again, what these maps are designed to do is designed to kind of put a spotlight on some areas so that we can keep an eye on them and see what's happening. So, okay, next slide. And next slide. All right, so I got to give a shout out to Dave and his boat skills and many of your folks that were out with us. This was last month. And I just thought it was interesting, so I wanted to just put this up here. These are some of the results from the macroalgae survey work that was done. And you can see in 2023, just last month, not much here. I don't think I put the previous one. Can you go to the next slide? I think no, I didn't. So just for time's sake, I didn't put any of the previous numbers up, but this is less than what was there last year at that time. So that's good. It seems like things are not as full of algae here as they were previous year, and that's after Ian. So that's potentially some good news. Okay, next slide. Then we're gonna move over to the east wall. So the east wall was really ground zero for a lot of that filamentous algae. Most of the loss, over 50% loss of grass in Charlotte Harbor between 18 and 20 occurred along the east wall. You can see that on this graphic. And the really bad news is that most of that loss was in the form of continuous. So we just had a wholesale loss of seagrass along the east wall in 2020. Again, we think that's tied to that prolonged red tide bloom that happened off the coast. Next slide.
What species of algae was that?
Most of it was that Chloropa fastigiata, but there's a bunch of other species that are, like, in my mind, more common. You see Acanthoptera, you see Gracilaria and Amorpha. But I know now I did not go on the survey. Mark Walton went on this survey, I think, with you guys. So I don't have firsthand knowledge of what was out there this year. But in previous years being out there, it was all that, just that filamentous, what we think is Chloropa fastigiata.
Looking a little better, but they're still out there.
Yeah, I've got a map. I've got your map coming up. So
Sorry,
you can speak to that. I just kind of wanted to point out a couple of things here, that we did see an additional 10% loss, of course, nowhere near what we saw between 18 and 20. And so you can kind of see the potential for a bottoming out. It's too soon to tell if next year, we see the same thing or hopefully a higher number. And maybe we can say, okay, we've kind of bottomed out and we're starting a slow recovery. Still a lot of attached algae out there, so no. And the PIs are really good at what they do, and they can tell the difference between a signature that is attached versus a signature that's drift algae. And of course, we supplement that with a lot of field verification points and talking to these guys and saying, hey, what are you seeing out there? So this purple on the map isn't the only place where there's algae. In fact, most of these open spaces, it's all filamentous algae as well. But hopefully, to Mindy's point, a little bit better than it was last year. Next slide. And so that's just the change analysis map on the right, shows you where we had a lot of loss and then some gains. So actually some losses along the bar down to the lower portion of that upper part of the east wall. But then we did see some decent gains too, especially in the inside, which was previously completely covered with algae. We're starting to see seagrass trying to come back in. All right, next slide. And so this was the most recent, I think, right? This was, yeah, January. This is what the data looked like from the macroalgae survey that y'all just finished up. So still a lot of algae out there. Again, to Dave's point, mostly Chlorpha fastigiata. You get into some of the other species as you go further south, but that's what it looks like as of 2-3 months ago. All right, next slide.
Yeah, I think that's this year.
Yeah, so-
2022.
Oh, okay, I'm sorry. Go
I was gonna
back.
say, It looks more than I
This is-
thought.
Yeah. Okay, so I
22.
actually didn't leave it 22. So this is what it would have looked like when this map was created. So when these images were collected to create these maps, this is what it looked like. And that is better than it was the year before that. Now, if you fast forward to just a couple months ago, you can see less algae out there. So that's good news. And we're hoping that we will see the seagrass beds respond in kind when we map them again this winter coming up. All right, next. And then just keep moving south to, for some reason, we split the east wall and north and south. I don't know why we do that, but we do. So this is the southern half of what we call the east wall. This is what it looked like in 2020. Again, lots of macroalgae, lots of this is again the purple is attached, but even mixed in with all this green, there's a lot of filamentous algae. So that's again, going back to my point about these maps don't imply anything about the health or the quality of the grass, even though this might be a continuous seagrass bed. It's not what's in behind this graph. It's covered in algae. There's filamentous algae all over the place. So it's not necessarily like beautiful, clean seagrass. Okay, next. All right, so here we are in 2022, and really the story here is not that bad. So 6% loss. No one wants to see any loss, but we did see about a 76-acre loss of grass. But again, look at where the losses are happening. They're happening in the patchy seagrass, in those more ephemeral, more sort of marginal areas. A 19% loss, about 100 acres, but we gained in the continuous category. So 24-acre gain, not much, 3%. Yeah, just above kind of the detection limit of the map, but we'll take it. I mean, any gain is good. And so we're seeing again the perhaps the beginning of a bottoming out. Maybe we'll see better numbers coming up. We don't know yet. Okay, next. And then this is the change analysis. So again, most of the losses along the deep edge. That's where you typically have your patchy, sparse, haliduli out in those light limited areas. We saw kind of a retreat of that grass. But I think more importantly, we saw a gain in that continuous grass that we had lost in 2020 after that big red tide event. So, maybe this is the sign that things are starting to kind of come back together. And again, this is pre-Ian, so we'll see what impact, if any, Ian had on the grasses. Okay, next. And this is just the same. This is the same slide that on the left-hand side. Only now I'm just highlighting the lower half of the east wall. And this is what it looked like at the time that this map would have been, or at the time that these images would have been flown. And then the next slide shows what it was a few months ago. So again, the trend seems to be less algae. It's still out there. And there's certainly areas where it's just covered. I know I don't have time to show Turtle and Bull Bay, but when I was out with Dave and Mindy's crew last month, lots of algae out there in Turtle Bay. Yeah. Grasses look good, but still lots of algae. Okay, next. And I think that's it. So, bottom line, really only a slight loss of seagrass, arguably within very close to the noise level of the map. Overall. So that's good news. And we did see this gain of 27% along the west wall. So that's even better news. But again, it's a mixed message because we saw some significant loss in that continuous seagrass bed, which is something we need to watch. So, there's a couple of caveats to this. Despite the fact that we didn't see much loss, would indicate that perhaps we're kind of at a bottomed out point. But we're still at record lows. So we can't, take our foot off the gas. That this is still of great concern to all of us. and we're still looking at losses in the east wall, along the northern part of the east wall especially. We see a lot of that drift algae and attached algae that persists, so we got to keep an eye on that area as well. And I think that's the last slide that has anything. Oh, well, then this is just a summary for like on the overall. Again, I think we kind of covered this earlier as far as, where some of the other estuaries are. Okay, and then I promise this is the second to last slide or third to last slide. All our data is now available online. So if you guys want to go to this website, we have the 22 map results there, and you can get everything from 1988 all the way to last year. And we are working on an Estuary app to allow folks to look at these data without having to download them and put them into your own ArcGIS or other, Google Earth viewer. It's an internal tool right now. We're still kind of beta testing it, but what it will allow you to do is it will allow you to toggle between 2 years, any 2 years you want from the period of record, and you can zoom it all over the place and zoom in and out, and it will show you and give you numbers for that area that you're looking at. So I think it'll be a really great tool for folks to use, but we're not ready to unveil it just yet. So we're still working on that with Estuary. Next slide. This is obviously not an all-inclusive list, but we can't do this without everybody. And pretty much everyone in this room is in some way, shape, or form intimately connected with these maps. So thank you all for all the help that you guys give us. Next. And of course, this is me. So if you have any questions that you think of after the meeting, shoot me an email or give me a call. Happy to help. So, stay tuned for 24. They're coming out. That's it.
Thank you.
Great, thank you.
Any questions for, yes?
Yeah, I have a couple, Chris. One is you're depicting your interpretation of seagrass distributions graphically in a map, and you've got various quality factors. And then you mentioned map noise error, the error in the classification. I've been interested in geostatistics for a long time. Is there any way of making that statistical error visual and plotting and represent it at the same time you have your map interpretations?
Right.
Plotted.
Like a plus or minus.
Yeah, like have a pale green band for the confidence interval or something like that around the.
I would love to talk to you, Greg, more about it, because we go back and forth on this. So keep in mind, when I say 2%, that is by no means a quantitative metric. There's no statistics behind it.
Yeah.
It's just a general rule of thumb. We have tried to figure out a way to make that more robust, and there are ways to do that. So one of the things that we're really trying to transition to is a semi-automated methodology, which then will allow us to generate those types of uncertainty statistics, which are really important. The reason we haven't jumped into the semi-automated world yet is largely due to the real changes we're seeing. We didn't want to switch technology, and we had this conversation in 2019. And we didn't want to switch to a different mapping method that might produce different results. Now, we've done a lot of side-by-side comparisons, and semi-automated gets you within about 90% of what a photo interpreter will do, with the exception of the 9113 patching. That's a problem. And the reason why that's a problem.
That's where I was heading for.
Yeah, it's a problem. It's the age-old mapping problem that when you're mapping a forest, at what point do the trees become so far apart that you stop calling it a forest? Like the space between the trees becomes an issue. And when we do those maps, the way we do them now with a PI that's drawing a polygon on a map, there is admittedly a lot of artistic license that goes into that. That's why it's really important that the PI knows what they're doing, has experience, and of course they use a lot of the previous work to kind of base their interpretation on. So the error that was created by somebody drawing an arbitrary line, you hope is maintained throughout the mapping process. But it's an inexact science. It's just a limitation of the map. By switching to semi-automated, then it becomes repeatable, because the computer, you have to set a buffer and you tell it when these pixels look this way, it's categorized as that. So you have a means by which you can look at error. The problem is that then your 9113 acreage will be very different than what we report. So if I did a semi-automated map in 24, you might see 60-70% less grass. Because all of a sudden the computer's not mapping as much of the space between the patches, if that makes sense.
It does, even if you train the model yourself with your human generated technique, you're still pretty confident it wouldn't be similar.
Oh, well, we've done the comparisons.
Okay, you've done that, yeah.
We've done them for Tampa Bay, Sarasota Bay. Actually, we
Okay.
did them for all the Suncoast estuaries.
Yeah,
And yeah, so we came up to about, I think, better than 90%.
okay,
Accuracy
okay,
or consistency with the manual method. With all the flux codes except for 9113. That one was
Right,
down around
okay.
60%.
right.
So we
okay.
still have to tweak that one. And I think what's gonna happen, Greg, is honestly, I think we're gonna, because it's a semi-automated method, I don't know if there'll ever be an easy button you just push and out comes the map.
Right.
And I think what'll happen is and by the way, they do this now. They use a semi-automated technique to do a first cut, and then you end up with thousands of little tiny polygons, and then the PIs will come in and manually adjust that. But I think with the Apache, there's always going to be a human element in that. It has to be.
Okay.
And this is not a Seagrass specific issue. This is an issue for mapping.
Oh, yeah,
Forests
no, that's.
Yeah,
I
buildings
understand. Yeah, I
everything.
realize.
Yeah.
Exactly. Well, thank you.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Right. Well, there's no time for any other question, but if you want to address them directly to, thank you so much. Let's do a round of applause. Thank you.